get started on this afternoon session. If everyone can come on in and take their seat. Shall I call out Michael Eisen? All right, so good afternoon. I'm Carol Greider from Johns Hopkins University, and I'm just here to moderate this review of the breakout sessions. So our first discussion will be from the breakout session 1A, and that's Rebecca Lijek.
Okay, so our group was tasked with discussing scientific commenting platforms and specifically open participation models. And the first thing we did was just to try to define the scope of our conversation, what's in, what's out. We decided basically everything's in. Anything that's open, publicly disseminated, and specifically focused on post-publication comments. There was the question of, does this include Twitter? And we decided, yes, our conversation is going to include Twitter. So anything beyond the traditional invited review process is what we were having a conversation about. So then the first question was, what are the strengths and weaknesses of these open participation systems? So in no particular order, some of the strengths we discussed was that these systems make articles living, breathing documents, that inclusiveness is a strength of these systems. It engages more than just the 2 or 3 invited reviewers. It also engages more than just scientists. These systems can catch things that are not caught in a traditional peer review system. And when they're centralized, these comments can allow for one-stop shopping for committees who need to assess scientists or their science. We think a strength is that it improves the science and reinvents scholarly discussion in modern times, and perhaps sheds some light on discussions or decision-making processes that previously or historically have been allowed only in the old boys club. So we think public commenting also promotes those who might be less gregarious or maybe don't have access to attend things like meetings and conferences. They can still access and be part of their networks remotely through these commenting systems. For editors, commenters can be a source of individuals that might be appropriate to invite for peer review, especially for difficult articles. And anonymous commenting enables quite critical comments to be made by individuals in the community who feel vulnerable, such as early career researchers, and don't feel comfortable making these comments through a traditional system where a name may or may not be attached. So our list of weaknesses was just as long. Weaknesses to these systems include the fact that comments are now distributed across many different platforms. These platforms are not centralized or integrated in any way. And so where does the reader go? They go to read the article and then perhaps make a comment there, but then they perhaps might also find another aggregator of comments. And some of this can lead to reader burnout and, again, dissipating of the power of the comments. We also talked about how some members of our scientific community and even the public don't know about these systems. And so if these comments are not equally accessed, not all scientists are engaging in this process, then that could introduce some bias into the consensus that is built in these commenting platforms. We talked about how the adoption of public commenting is very low. And so we sort of talked about why that might be. Probably because it's unclear what the purpose of these comments is. What is the goal of them? And who is the audience? Who is reading it? Is it the authors of the scientific articles themselves? Is it the public? We talked again about inclusiveness now as a negative because of trolls, right? So anybody can make a comment, and that can lead to changes in quality of those comments. We talked about how in the experience of people in our group, 99% of the comments are negative. And is that a good or bad thing? We talked about how given the volume of comments that it can be hard to get authors to respond to those comments. And so are we really creating this living document that we think we might be creating? I think that's some, yeah. So the volume and the clunkiness of the systems and the burnout of the users were some real weaknesses. The last one I want to say is a real fear of reprisals for comments that are left, especially if there's a name associated with those comments. Okay. So the next question was, how can constructive commentary be incentivized? And we first started by agreeing that this needs to be incentivized, that right now it's not incentivized. There was a comment made that the median number of comments on a paper is currently 0. And so it's mostly big, splashy articles that are getting the majority of these public comments, and that it is the invitation process of an editor to a reviewer to make formal comments on an article that drives the response rate. And so how do we incentivize that in the public commenting sphere? So we talked about one incentive is more clearly defining the goals and objectives of these commenting platforms. One way to incentivize participation is to prevent anonymity. This was controversial in our conversation. Other people talked about adding DOIs to these comments. We talked about cash payment and whether that was an appropriate incentive for creating constructive comments. If journal editors take note of these public comments, would that allow early career researchers to be identified as good participants in the formalized peer review process? And that in and of itself might be an incentive for early career researchers to participate in commenting. And similarly, if hiring committees and promotion committees took this participation, open commenting participation into account, that might also incentivize people to do it. We also thought that perhaps a more broad incentive would be that if our goal is to get rid of a system where journal name matters and impact factor matters, then that in and of itself was enough to incentivize one participating in this open platform for commenting. And then we sort of ended that conversation by saying maybe it's not necessary to incentivize because of our current social media culture where we all feel we feel like it's very important for us to share a picture of the food that we're eating, and that maybe that culture in and of itself is enough to get people to participate in the system. Okay. So then question 3 was, how can these systems be effectively moderated? We talked about anonymity, and then we talked about the fact that it's not a binary thing. You don't either have a name attached or don't have a name attached, that there's a third option of robust pseudonymity, where an anonymous reviewer can still build a reputation. And so the quality of reviews and comments can create a reputation for quality without personal identifiers being used. Many of the people shared their experiences with these open systems and say that the platforms themselves often start the moderating process and set standards for comments in the community that they are moderating. And then later that community sort of takes over and establishes that culture and then self-moderates. And that perhaps this moderation might be less necessary in platforms where it's a self-selected group of scientists versus something like Twitter. We talked about whether moderation is done by paid staff or by volunteers and how that might depend on the platform and the volume of the comments. And we had also talked about whether comments should be in line in the article or at the bottom of the article. So do you have to highlight figure 2 and then provide constructive criticism of figure 2, or do you have to scroll down to the bottom of a bunch of people yelling and add your voice to that commentary, and whether there was a benefit or advantage to those two types of commenting. And then finally, our fourth question was, how can open commentary be integrated into a formal peer review process in a productive way? And should preprint comments be taken into account in editorial decisions? And this is where we sort of switched the scope of our conversation, because up till now we've been talking about post-publication commentary, and this question was specifically focused on preprint commentaries. And so we thought that the question of how can this be integrated into a formal process is simply adding a question in the submission process of, have you put up a preprint and have any comments been made? We talked about how that might introduce some author bias if they are summarizing their own comments. And we also talked, when we posed the question, should preprint comments be taken into account in editorial decisions? Someone said, why not? And then there was just some quiet in the room. And then we talked a little bit about why not. And the few things that we came up with was that, what if these public comments work against me somehow in peer review? And do journals uniformly check for preprint comments, and could that introduce some bias into the editorial process? And finally, that there's not a consistent timing of posting preprints, either before or after submitting to a journal, so comments may or may not be available. Great, thanks.
Okay, so our next report out is from Lawrence Rajanandan from Science Matters and the University of Zurich.
Hi there. So my colleague already described quite many parts of the discussion that we also discussed, so I'm going to keep it very short. So we did discuss on these open participation models, but it was a bit unfortunate that PubMed Commons died just before talking about this. So, but we still continued. We talked about the strengths and weaknesses of open participation. We talked about incentives. We talked about moderation and how we can formally integrate into the peer review process. When it came to strengths, we talked about annotations. We talked about hypothesis. This is one of the best commenting tools that we thought it is. So with the collaboration with eLife, we brought out that you could add granular details. One could also clarify. What we found very interesting is that people can privately communicate to the author instead of just publicly shaming, putting out these annotations or commentary saying that, why didn't you do this? The private channel to the authors, we thought it was very good. And one of the things one could also do is to integrate with their ORCID ID and maybe even incentivize in terms of credit that I'll talk about later. On the strength side, there was also another thing that we talked about, which is the involvement of PubPeer, which doesn't have a great PR, but it still does great in terms of cleaning up the literature, and it's great for the science, but not great for the authors. So this is a tool that we thought this also helps science by allowing anonymous commentary on fraudulence and flaws in the paper. And when it came to weakness, we also identified what my colleague said is that there are not too many comments that are there in the paper, right? So we felt that this is something it needs to change. It could get better, but we'll come to the second part, which is like the reason that there are not too many commentaries out there is because there are also not too many incentives. On an average, an estimation of around 90 to 95% of the articles don't have comments. So the reason that we thought could be, it's not just that the scientific community does not want to comment, it's just that people don't comment. So even when you go to channels like YouTube or social media outlets, it's not that you see 10% of the viewers comment, but it's probably in the range of 1 or 2%, 1 or less, 1% or less. And when it came to scientific community, scientific scholarly space, the sheer numbers are very low. So maybe like 100 people look at it or 50 people look at it, so you probably have 1 comment or less. And so it's really a numbers game when it came to commenting. And this is also the reason why we need to somehow incentivize. We need to make it more attractive for people to comment on either preprint or published literature. So this brings me to the part on incentivization as to how do we do this. First of all, it takes time, and second of all, it takes energy, and you put a lot of thought into it. And somehow one of the weaknesses is really that even the authors that you comment on the paper, and you directly ask the author to address some of the issues, even the authors don't respond. So if the author would respond to the comments, this would already be a good incentive to go. And most of the times, this reaction from the authors don't happen. The other way to incentivize would be to integrate with identification services like ORCID, and that enters into some kind of a record. It enters into a profile of the researcher that I was a commenter for so many articles, and also the version control that the author responded, and it made the paper better. One of the ideas was also to have a space in a CV. Today, we do have spaces like I'm an editor or editor-in-chief, I'm a reviewer for these journals. Why not have comment? I am a commenter or an annotator in these journals. So maybe this is also something that we could encourage, both from the lab heads as well as funders, for example, that this could be a consideration for early stage researchers who want to contribute on the commenting side. And we talked about moderation. This was also interesting that we thought it's mostly cultural, and then the way the people respond to criticism is also, it's not homogeneous. And we thought that one could also have these private channels, unless it is really, really necessary, one could directly address the authors and make the paper better, as Andrew McCallum was talking about these theorems, that there is this problem. This is also something that one could fix it with the author directly. And bioRxiv set a very good example by allowing communities to participate as the commenters. That instead of allowing individuals that would participate into commenting, what they do is to invite societies like ASM, for example, or SFN, Society for Neuroscience. This is a vetted and a validated community which has interest in terms of collaboration, in terms of making things better, as opposed to some random troll that could, random person who could disguise as a troll or as something. So in this way, I think as communities participate, there's also an incentive to make it better, and the communities take care of moderation, how to moderate. The last thing that we talked about is really the formal integration. We thought it was extremely interesting because this is the first time some experiment like this happens, that there is this commenting on a preprint before the actual paper is published. One way would be that the comments somehow they could act as, they could precede peer review. And in this, when we do this, we could also involve early stage researchers, postdocs, graduate students who could comment. And we thought this Prachi Awasthi's idea of a journal club, it's extremely interesting that these papers, these preprints could be put out in this journal club format and get the comments. And this is taken into editorial and reviewer decision when the actual peer review of the paper happens. So this could be integrated, we thought, in a formal way, and we thought it's an incredibly powerful process by opening up the participation process. I think that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.
Okay, moving on to 2A, we have Liz Ferguson from Wiley.
Thanks. So we were given the task of thinking about how we'd improve traditional peer review and reduce the reviewer burden at the same time. We started out with a discussion of the problems of traditional peer review, which is pretty much how we started out this meeting in general. We tried to focus in our feedback on the issues that haven't emerged over the course of the last day, but which are no doubt fairly well known to many in this crowd. So one of the things that hasn't really come up before this point is that the current system is still allowing too much to fall on too few. Having a closed peer review system means that there are a number of prolific authors out there who are not doing their own duty back in service to the review community. And that, coupled with the fact that there's a great deal more research now available and being generated, means that the burden is falling on a smaller and smaller population. So we felt that that was particularly critical and had quite a long discussion about whether we feel that 2 or 3 reviewers is still enough. And the answer to that seemed to be variable. It depends very much on the work that's being assessed at any given time and whether you need expert reviewers for stats or for software or for methodology and so on. The burden is certainly not equal across all journals, and it's definitely not equal between individual papers. We also felt that the current system, with some exceptions, and there are some exceptions, means that the burden of checking everything falls on reviewers. There are few journals that allow other checks to be made by technical staff, technical editors, and so on outside the system. Those that do are fairly well represented here, but that's not true of the remaining 28,000 journals in the world. We were all pretty inspired as well yesterday by Mike Lauer's talk and felt that there was a good role for some top-tier journals to play in issuing guidelines about the best stats treatments that should be required by more journals in the system generally, and that clear guidance would actually be very helpful in moving quickly down that path. We felt quite strongly that funders needed to fix some problems upstream of the publishing system around addressing issues of underpowered studies and so on, so that didn't necessarily all fall on publishers. But having said that, journals could do a quick job of better describing the power behind the statistics in the papers that they're presenting. And to do that would be to provide a real service to science. And that's something that we felt could get off the ground really very quickly. We are duty-bound to report that there was discord in the group about the merits of post-publication peer review, but we can leave that for another discussion. We were asked to consider what benefits could be gained from sharing peer reviews between journals, the potential downsides of doing so, and why the process is currently not more common. Pretty much everyone in the room actually supported the idea of sharing reviews between journals. The concerns that were expressed, such that they were concerns, were more around implementation rather than around the policy of doing so. It has all the obvious benefits that everyone knows of reducing the time to publication, reducing the redundancy in the system, reducing the burden that we've talked about already. There was some concern, again, around implementation, that reviewing for specific journals means reviewers will occasionally hone in on 2 or 3 things that they feel will be particularly relevant to an editor of that journal that will lead to a paper especially being rejected, and may, in the process of doing that, skip over 3 or 4 other factors that may be critical for a second journal to be considering. We had quite a lot of discussion about whether editors needed to know the identity of reviewers when looking at a review coming through from another journal. There was a variety of practices and policies represented in the room, so we didn't reach consensus on this. We decided that it might be useful to have an optional identification system. We certainly felt that both authors and editors should be entitled to ping the editors of previous reviewing journals and ask for reviews to be forwarded or provided in some other mechanism. And we also felt as a group that reviews should be taken through the process from when an article first starts out on its journey to its eventual publication as an open review. Where we had some discussion was whether editorial and desk rejects should count in that process, and we decided to leave that a bit open. It's kind of of interest to editors and publishers to see how often that happens. We weren't sure whether it was as much value to readers and authors. We were then asked whether we should be paying more attention to scientific data in peer review or whether the present system is adequate. So the answer is yes, absolutely. Data should be made available to reviewers, and therefore no, the present system is not adequate. We had a discussion again over whether journals should make it a blanket requirement at submission or whether journals should make authors provide data if requested by reviewers or at different stages during the process. So rather than requiring a blanket submission policy, whether it should be provided for journals that actually make it to review, articles rather that make it to review, or to articles that are subject to some revision stage. And at that point, there's a lot of varying practice here, which is probably not necessarily that helpful to authors when trying to figure out what they need to do. There's a lot of discussion about practical issues, data file sizes and so on. And a fair amount of discussion about the fact that quality control for journals that require either accessibility to data or some form of publication of data on publication of an article is already quite a significant burden, either in terms of workload or in terms of the complexity of the work required. So checking if an author, for example, has made all of the data available that they should or has even properly cited and referenced it for some journals is currently the job of a full-time, if not more than one full-time person. There's very variable roles between journals and repositories in curating material that's shared as data. There's an absence of standards. The long tail of data makes all of this very difficult, but there are good examples out there of what can be achieved when journals attempt to include data in the peer review process. We felt that to exclude methods and software from this discussion would obviously not be helpful, that we need those in order for that assessment to be truly valuable and useful. But given that we were asked to consider how we reduce the burden placed on reviewers, this is not a way to reduce burden on reviewers. So our ultimate assessment of that, I guess, was that specialist data reviewers may be the most practical answer. Whether it's the most scalable is another question. But we absolutely felt that data and associated outputs needed to be much more front and center of the review process. We were then asked to assess whether there is the right balance of evaluating data and data presentation versus impact and journal suitability in a particular in the review process. We took that to mean whether we have the right balance of technical assessment of work versus the criteria that different journals use when considering whether to publish it or not. There is clearly a very mixed system at present. We came to the conclusion that individual journals have the right balance for themselves, but every journal has a different balance, and therefore the system as a whole does not. That's confusing for authors and reviewers. Again, we had a discussion about once the assessment of the appropriateness of a piece of work for an individual journal is concluded, the assessment of the technical merit of the work may not be as complete as it might otherwise be if people were asked to review solely for technical merit. The obvious answer there is to ask reviewers to only assess for technical issues. However, journals that do that get a very mixed response to it. Reviewers like to be able to add their own nuance to the work that they're looking at. So even when an editor directs a reviewer to only look at technical pieces of work, that doesn't necessarily happen. And that we also felt that the experience that an individual researcher has had at a journal as a reviewer may also sway the way they behave in response as a reviewer at a later date. There was a second part to that question, which is whether we need better training in peer review. We've seen throughout this meeting that formal training in peer review is not necessarily helpful, and we took that on board. We did talk about some of the more modular training programs that are now on offer either from individual journals or from publishers, but essentially felt that there was no replacement for a good supervisor or PI or mentor for on-the-job training. We then talked about collaborative peer review, where reviewers exchange between one another their comments on manuscripts and try to come to consensus on it, and editors engage very heavily in that process. We all considered this tremendously beneficial. Authors love it and find it hugely beneficial to their ability to navigate what they need to do to make the work publishable. Now, the intent of this process is to give a very clear and quick decision to authors about what they need to do to fix it. But those in the room who have experience of operating this system say it is simply unscalable and pretty much unsustainable for reviewers and also the journals that operate it. It can be a huge amount of work with email chains proliferating all over the place. Some journals in the room make it optional for reviewers, and where they do, despite the value remaining extremely high, it was felt for authors, reviewers, and editors alike, the level of engagement with the process is rather low. We felt, actually as a group, it would be helpful for others in this room to think about this issue and whether, given the undoubted benefits we'll perceive in collaborative peer review, to see whether we can't come up with a more technological way of responding to it rather than taking out of the system or in existing EEO systems, a kind of work that just proliferates that chain of communication. And one of the most important points that came up repeatedly throughout our session and that I want to close with is that the role of editors came up a huge deal, much more so than it has done in the rest of the discussion in this meeting so far. Very specifically, but not exclusively, the role of the editor as a negotiating force between reviewers and authors came to the fore. So there's a very strong consensus that good editors are going to facilitate discussion and discourse between reviewers and authors in order to improve a particular piece of work. They don't require it when it's not necessary, but authors won't always know that that is part of the role of the editor to achieve, so we need to raise more awareness of that. And that was where we got to. Thank you.
Okay, our next report out from 2B is Ian Cheeseman from the Whitehead.
So we had a similar overview of a goal of trying to discuss ways to improve the traditional peer review systems and also to reduce reviewer burden. So the way that we started this discussion of really improving traditional peer review is a discussion of trying to disambiguate the different functions of peer review. So there clearly is a need to assess the technical quality, but then we also have these other criteria of journal selection and fit. And so we felt as a group that this was a really important distinction, and that this actually helps explain where a lot of the issues in this process are coming from. And yet, as a reviewer, it can be very hard to separate these two assessments. So when we're thinking about papers, we really need to have three considerations. One, is it technically sound? Two, are the conclusions justified by the data? And three, is this a substantial advance and that it would be a good fit for the journal? And so perhaps it might be helpful to give more specific instructions when we're creating the review, maybe separate these out into three separate sections so that you can review these distinctly and independently. And this may also help with some portability between journals so that you can identify, for example, the technically sound considerations being separate from the nature of the advance and the fit from the journal. There was also discussion about whether maybe certain people might be better suited to contribute to some of these versus others. So, for example, can we encourage more postdocs to provide reviews, particularly related to some of the technical aspects of the paper? And so many of these people might be underrepresented right now in terms of reviewing and could create a better diversity of the reviewers that are out there. And people who are actually doing a lot of these experiments might be better suited to contribute to that and then bring them into the system. The discussion of the fact that there was a strong reviewer burden, though, was also present. And so if we can assign reviewers in this way, then to address these points, maybe this can be more easily generated so that they can be carried to a different journal. So one of the things that we discussed quite a bit was this idea of how we actually share peer reviews between journals. So the analogy I had for that was you have a cell phone, and in the old days, your number was trapped on the phone. We need some sort of number portability so that you can actually take that information with you and not necessarily have to initiate a process over again. And so, for example, at say a quote-unquote top-tier journal, maybe your paper's not technically flawed, but it doesn't meet that impact. It should be quite easy to transfer it. And so there was discussion of that in the room, particularly for people who were representing journals, and they said that in their experience, for that process to work well, you absolutely needed to know the identity of the reviewers involved. So similar to the conversation that we just heard, but in this case, a very strong take on the fact that it's not just the review itself, but knowing who that person is and where it's coming from and being able to evaluate what that information and context means is important. And so creating a system in which you can ensure a much more common opt-in for a transfer of both your review and the identity when you're doing that. There's also the discussion that maybe this was a good argument for why journal-agnostic peer review could make things much more portable, that then you have sort of an ingrained system to be able to drive that. We had, surrounding this, kind of a big discussion related to the psychology of that and the sort of burden psychological toll. So we all know that the editorial rejection can be a huge burden for the journal and also takes a huge psychological toll on the authors and particularly our students and postdocs. But that there is also these sort of psychologies that drive this, and in part, actually, this is maybe our own fault as a community, is that we're enforcing this upon ourselves, and so we're talking about this need to change, but we're often the people that are driving that. We talked a lot about the process of triaging and editorial rejection, and in particular, this strong incentives that people have these days, whether it be getting jobs or getting funding or just perception, to submit in the very top tier journals. And so this idea that you essentially have to try, even if the actual chance of it getting in there is quite low. And so essentially this is driving everyone to submit to those journals. And certainly the authors have a responsibility in facilitating this journal choice and this mask-making process, but actually it can be harder these days than maybe in the past to really define what is the right fit for some of these journals. And this triaging and multiple rounds of submission and review can create quite a big burden. We did discuss quite a bit about this proposal for the peer feedback system that Ron described before the break, and all of the different aspects of what that means and how you create a system that works well, and that we could sort of take up as a community. And clearly there's a lot of things that we would need to discuss and address in terms of, whether there are papers that could be editorially rejected from this process, the nature of what the review means there, and the fact that maybe this isn't a one-size-fits-all process, but that a good matchmaking service could really expedite different aspects of the publication process. So then there was the question of, well, if we have a system like that, do we really need journals at all? And I think there was also, of course, the feeling that journals play an important role in curating the literature, highlighting different things, and advertising the work, as well as many other aspects of what's required for the publication process overall. So I think one of the statements that I liked the best is that perhaps we shouldn't expect there to be a universal solution that solves all of these problems. And instead, really what we need is a multiplicity of solutions. So we need something, for example, like peer feedback, or maybe we need a tagging system, and that these are accomplishing and solving different things, but it's not that one of these necessarily is tailor-made to be a panacea to solve all the problems. And then I think I just want to end with maybe one more personal statement, which is that, I think we've heard a lot over the past day or so about all the challenges that are there. And clearly there are a number of issues that we face with publications and scientific process and peer review in general. I personally am really quite optimistic about our ability to identify and resolve some of these things. So I started grad school 20 years ago, and at that point, actually, the electronic systems that we all sort of take for granted these days just really didn't exist. And I think just the way that has transformed how we publish and how we deal with things, I think has been quite remarkable, and I've seen that just sort of in the time that I've been there. If you take preprints, that is something where most of us 2 years ago, at least my colleagues, had never heard of that. That was something that wasn't even on their radar. And I think that the uptake of that and the way that that's just transformed the daily way that we think about doing science has been dramatic. And so I think that provides a really good example of how we think about these things. So we do need a diversity of solutions. We need creative ways to be able to approach some of these things. But we're going to make, we're going to vote with our feet. We're going to choose which of those actually work. And I think the thing that's been really powerful about preprints, it was a really fascinating idea. It's really changed things, but also there's been a really great adoption because it really works and because it solves a lot of problems that people were facing. And I think the same is true for this peer review process, whether it be separating the peer review process from the journals or the tagging or other things. Those things being picked up is going to be because they make a difference and because of the impact that we have. And so I'm quite optimistic about our ability as a community to help identify some of these solutions and then also take these to change the way that things work. Thanks.
Okay, our next report is from 3A, and that's Stefano Bertuzzi.
Good afternoon, everyone. Our group 3A was tasked with the topic of new ways of evaluating papers. And the first question that we were tasked to discuss, we didn't discuss, it was whether a hierarchy of journal is sufficient for the evaluation. The reason why we didn't discuss, because it was a resounding no. Let's move on. So we focused instead, and there was a lot of enthusiasm in the group for the idea of preprints to serve as journal clubs. And really a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of discussion around this. And in particular, there was the sense that it's a tool for expanding the circle of reviewers, of commenting, and also making a role of pre-publication particularly meaningful. I really like what were just said about, use a tool to solve a real problem, and this seems like to resonate with the group in this direction. And also the fact that would involve more different demographics, different people who may not be involved otherwise. Some also saw that as a risk, that it could be a biased system because of that. But again, one size fits all is probably not the answer. It's a tool that could be very valuable. So a lot of enthusiasm for this. Then we moved on to the issue of evaluating new ways of evaluating papers and the models that were proposed in the session this afternoon. There was enthusiasm also for the idea of what we call the layered reviewing. So instead of tasking one reviewer with a big kaplunk, and you have to review this big paper, is going to suck up a lot of your time and some aspects you may not be an expert in, the tasking and parsing out the work and say, we'll really care about your opinion on the statistics of this paper because you're an expert of this, and forget about all the rest. That's why we're tasking you with this, and whether that's the ethics, the statistics, they could be very valuable. The group also highlighted 3 concerns around this, this issue, which doesn't mean that shouldn't be done, but to be mindful of. The first one is that if we parse out the responsibility too much and you go to super experts for each of the issues, you may be fostering that hypercriticism on that particular issue, and people may be really in the weeds and lose a sense of the forest. So there's value, but also something to be mindful of. The second is that the group imagined that there would be some workflow issues, both for the curators and for the submitters, so something to think about. And last, the concern that how can this be integrated in a way that it truly complements what is needed and what's already there and doesn't duplicate what's already existing. The group then moved on to discuss how peer review, open peer review and in evaluating paper could add value in issues that are typically very burdensome for journals, such as image manipulation or data that doesn't sound, and crowdsourcing and getting more eyes to look at that and spot some issues could be of big help. We also talked about the fact that an open peer review, like it was described in the afternoon session in the various models, could add value also for established journals in the publication decision if those reviews are transparent and attributed, and it could be a tool that editors could use. And on the issue of editors, we also talked a lot about the value of editors, and in particular, also on the relationship between editors and reviewers, that is a very important relationship that exists in the evaluation of the paper and in the relationship with the author, which should not be overlooked when you have a lot of, pass me the term, it wasn't used in the session, but I think that's what the group meant, disjointed, coming from many different directions and not in a context. It could be, there could be something lost there than what the role that a true editor, in synthesizing and getting advice from the reviewer. So again, not a reason for not doing it, but something to be considerate of. The aspect, though, that was considered that the open peer review would, in the models described, would be certainly helping with is getting away from the clubbish problem that you typically have in this editor-reviewers relationship. So it goes both ways. Other element is that was underscored in the group was that of the value of data curation, and could there be interactions and use of bioRxiv and the various repositories for incentivizing, storing, connecting, relating data curation, not just a big dump, but really indicating that those data are somewhere and are valuable and can be used. Could that be an element that adds value to the scientific community? And finally, the last point was that was discussed in the group is that the badging issue, and there is certainly value in having a badging on a paper and certain aspects of it. There were some concerns about how broad can the validity of the badging could be. If it's some specific issues like conflict of interest have been checked or data have been stored and deposited here, that is probably tractable. But if the badging becomes of a broader scope, there are concerns about, how could that happen in a way that's truly reliable and satisfactory for the community. I think this is all that we had discussed. Thank you for your attention.
And our final report will be from Anna Hatch of DORA.
Hi, so our group also discussed new ways of evaluating papers. The first question, very likewise, we came to the conclusion that impact factor is not a great metric very quickly. But there was a discussion about the need and maybe the demand of the community for hierarchy and evaluating pieces of literature. So a straw man was proposed in the group that the JIF is convenient, despite the acknowledgement that it is a flawed statistic. And we are relying on it because of its convenience. So with that, we started looking at new models of evaluating evaluating papers. So initially, we discussed the objective peer review model with an added layer where reviewers are asked to provide these categorical scores of badges or tags. And some of the categories that we quickly brainstormed were scientific quality, long-term value, the excitement or the wow factor of a paper, the originality, the rigor, are there additional scholarly outputs like databases? But, as we were brainstorming all of these categories, one of the concerns was this is going to be a big data problem, and each field could have different categories. So we would need to be very careful in implementation and thinking about scaling up. But as another part of that conversation was, having all of these different category scores, allows you to even create like a cluster score or like a heat map of a paper that might give more insight into its quality. From then on, we went to talk a little bit about article level metrics. And, as a group, we decided that they are useful, but one of their drawbacks is that it takes time to calculate. And there's merit in providing assessment right at the beginning. So from then, we looked to the NIH BioSketch, which has these qualitative sections where you can describe your research contributions, and that's used as a way to step away from the journal impact factor. But one of the drawbacks in the room that was said is that, even though you have this BioSketch where you're describing your contributions, people are still looking at the CV, and they're still looking for the journal of where it's published. So while you're making that effort to get away, it's still sneaking in. And, as part of this discussion of, JIF is a convenience for journal hierarchy, we also wanted to be considerate of what are these other brands that influence evaluation. Are you the prodigy of a very famous scientist? Are you working at an elite institution? Does your geographic location, does that impact or provide biases when you're reviewing someone else's work? So we wanted to be considerate of that in future solutions. And then, we came to the point that there's a lot for funders to do and a lot that funders can do. And then as we were discussing this, we went into the idea or the conversation about bioRxiv and how this really seems to be a right place for evaluation, or sorry, a right place for experimentation about evaluation. So one of the anecdotes that we heard was that in a faculty hiring process, every candidate had submitted a paper to bioRxiv. And so people couldn't rely on the journal of where it was published. They had to read the paper and dive into the content and make their own opinions. And so I think, the conclusion in the room was that bioRxiv, could be used as a great platform for experimenting with evaluation, and indeed it's already been done. Another thing we discussed was how publishing peer reviews could it be a way to decouple a paper's evaluation from a particular journal. So when you're reading the review, that would take it a step away from, what name is it published, and again, focusing that back to the content of the paper. And another idea that was brought forward to the group was, what if you turn to evaluation based on structuring peer reviews around the structure of a paper? And this, would be a very comprehensive, it could be a very valuable process, but again, when you make something very comprehensive, there's a good deal, an amount of effort to go back into this. So with all of our conversations, really trying to strike the balance of, what is good for implementation, but what is also very useful. And then one of the last things that I'll just briefly touch on was that we discussed the possibility of using machine learning in peer review in terms of evaluation, but also in terms of choosing referees. And the consensus there that there's a lot of power in being able to do this and use technology to really drive peer review forward. But then there was also this statement of, well, we want to be cautious because we want to be careful that we're not falling into the biases of the current system. And that's all for our group, but thank you very much.